So it's really delightful to be here. I'm just going to apologize a little bit because I'm not quite in the right space-time zone, but I think we should be able to manage. I really want to thank Fiona for conceiving of this conference, and I think it is just a delight that we can think very carefully about questions of animalities. I also pronounce it that way. And also want to thank Dinesh for getting me here and all of the folks who worked to pull this together. Also, I'm very excited for seeing the gallery show, the artists and the curators, so I'm really very thankful. The title of my talk I'm going to hold, well, no, I won't. I'll show you what it is. The reason we haven't seen it is it's called Just Say No to Lobotomy. And before we get into this somewhat ugly topic, it's really unpleasant. It's early morning, I think. I want to start with a bit of levity and show you a very silly, dark comedy video. And we might, I wonder if, I guess, well, we'll just see if we could see it and hear it. Should I just click on it? Hopefully we can hear it.
Arthritis got you down, the lobotomy will solve all your problems. By muting the impulses from the thalamus, we can eliminate excess emotion and distress. With 2 simple taps and we stabilize the personality. Simple, I've done a ton of these. Believe me, I care. It's transorbital. No more worries, rebellious desires. A personality rejuvenation, just like Rose Kennedy. With 1 simple twist, and we stabilize the personality. Just a couple of taps past a thin bony plate. Less than 10 minutes. We will break the supremacy of emotion over reason.
No way! Screw this!
Now, dear. Everything will be just fine. Life doesn't have to be this hard. Believe me, things will be better this way.
Okay, I hope that you're not going to have that silly song stuck in your head for the rest of the morning. I think that the case of lobotomy, despite its extremity, nicely illustrates several of the points that I want to highlight in my presentation this morning, and it's particularly poignant given the topic of our conversation. I'm not going to talk too much about the nuances of the case, although I'll talk a bit about it, but I'm really hoping that we might think more about lobotomies over the next couple of days. The talk that I want to present is about the central role and significance of affect, or emotion, or sentiment, or care in our relationships with each other and other animals. And I'll talk about the ways that affect has been understood and rejected and policed, that's the main idea, and interrogate the various attempts to have it removed from our discourse and theory, from our activism, and even from our brains. These efforts are inevitably unsuccessful, but the impact of the rejection of affect has nonetheless been intense, and I think it's hindered our collective efforts at making the world better for animals, or at least less horrible. And indeed, we're not able to fully be, I think, in meaningful relationships when a big part of our cognitive affective capacities are cut off, even if not technically cut out. My talk will be in 3 parts. In the first, I'll discuss the scientific malady of remarkable proportions, and then I'll turn to an analysis of the rejection of affect. And finally, I'll revisit the sort of affect I've been advocating, what I call entangled empathy, which resists the division between reason and emotion, and seeks to not just enhance our pursuit of justice, but to provide us with meaningful, caring, crazy, in the sense of counter-normative, excessive ways to enrich our relationships in that pursuit. I did want to say a little bit about crazy, given the sort of disability rights criticism of the use of that term. So I thought it would be important at least to acknowledge that the word crazy is currently in many circles thought to be an ableist term. And I think many have rightly argued that we should be more specific when we use the term. And I agree with that. There's a really interesting sort of history of the term, but because the term often refers to a particularly racialized and gendered notion of excess, which I think Fiona just mentioned, I have an urge to reclaim it. It's one of the terms that I actually think would be great to reclaim the crazy, but it's not really my place to do that, and so I'm looking forward to being in solidarity with disability rights scholars and activists in the project of reclamation, if that makes sense to them. Okay, so let me start with lobotomies. That's the first part of the paper. Walter Freeman, who was the spoof lobotomist in the video, actually did drive around the United States performing lobotomies in a lobotomobile. He's reported to have performed something like 2,500 lobotomies on patients from 23 states. His first patient in 1936, I'm so excited that you mentioned our widow who went over the falls. His first patient, Freeman's first patient in 1936 was a housewife from Kansas, and there were many, many housewives who had lobotomies. There was a housewife who was a 29-year-old who was the first to receive the transorbital lobotomy. That's the lobotomy that was referred to as the ice pick lobotomy. His last lobotomy was performed on another housewife, Helen Mortensen, who was subjected to her third lobotomy and died from a brain hemorrhage. And that was in February of 1967. And after that, Freeman was banned from operating. In a 2005 National Public Radio broadcast in the United States, there was a story of one of the youngest people to have a lobotomy, Howard Dully. He was 12 years old when his stepmothers submitted him to a lobotomy. And the story is shocking. Dully, with Charles Fleming, a writer, wrote an incredible memoir about his experience. It's extraordinarily moving. The NPR story included a few oral histories, one of a housewife who seemed glad to have had a lobotomy as she was suffering from depression. Her husband had arranged for her to have the lobotomy, and apparently this interview was the first time they had talked about it, and the lobotomy was in 1962, and this was 43 years later. And in this interview, Patricia, that's the woman who had the lobotomy, says she doesn't remember anything at all about it. And Glenn, her husband, says, quote, "We were coming back from San Jose following the operation, and Pat informed me that she couldn't wait to get home because she wanted to go down and file for divorce." Patricia responds, I don't remember that at all. I don't think I said it. And then Glenn says, I think I just went on driving and ignored the situation and began to wonder to myself, how much good did this operation accomplish, really? I could see no changes in most areas, except she's much easier to get along with. Pat then says, I was more free. Just not to be so concerned about things. I went home and I started living, I guess, is the best I can say. Just started living again and was able to get back into things like cooking and shopping and that kind of thing. The idea of altering the brain in order to facilitate social compliance and alter undesirable behavior has an interesting history. Surgical interventions reached their heyday in the 1940s as mental asylums were brimming over with cases after the Second World War. In that decade alone, more than 18,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States and tens of thousands more in other countries. Freeman wrote in Psychosurgery, Intelligence, Emotion, and Social Behavior Following Prefrontal Lobotomy for Mental Disorders that the frontal lobes are essential for satisfactory social adaptation. Certain individuals may suffer from perverted activity of these areas and may become capable of better adaptation when these lobes are partially inactivated. Partial separation of the frontal lobes from the rest of the brain resulted in reduction of disagreeable self-consciousness, abolition of obsessive thinking, and satisfaction with performance, even though the performance is inferior in quality. The emotional nucleus of the psychosis is removed, he wrote. The sting of the disorder is drawn. He goes on to describe the history of surgical intervention in these disorders. And not surprisingly, female genitalia were often thought to be the site of the disorder. He writes, quote, after the development of antisepsis, surgeons began searching about here and there. I just love this idea of surgeons searching about here and there. Surgeons searching about here and there. Whoa, okay. Searching about here and there for offending organs that were supposed to be causing mental disorder. The first attack was upon the internal genitalia, particularly the ovaries, because of the notion that functional nervous disorders were produced by the wanderings of the uterus into various parts of the body. After several years of experimentation and the sacrifice of many thousands of ovaries, this was not Freeman, this was Freeman's reporting on the history, the conclusion was reached that castration in the female, while sometimes exercising a temporary benefit, was not the solution to the problem of mental disorder. On the contrary, it frequently brought in its wake a train of undesirable symptoms that increased the discontent and often the misbehavior of the sufferer. In the early days of medicine, when all sorts of different theories were floated about the causes of illness, it was not uncommon to think that they were due in some way to a depraved state of the humors, which was usually the fault of the sufferer. Thomas Sydenham, a well-known 17th century British physician, noted that female hysteria was the second most common disease, just behind fevers. He attributed the malady to irregular motions of the animal spirits, which were caused by some great commotion of mind, occasioned by some sudden fit, either of anger, grief, terror, or like passions. 200 years later, it's only slightly surprising that women were the most common patients, and even today, women suffer more mental disturbances than men. A short piece in Psychology Today reports that, quote, it's easy to write off this epidemic of mental illness among women as the result of hormonal issues and gender difference, and even to argue that women are simply more emotional than men. The truth, though, is that psychiatrists aren't really sure why mental illness is more common among women. I have a theory, but I will leave that. It starts with a P, ends with the archy. But back to this history. Whoop. The first person on record to perform a surgical procedure to relieve the commotion of the mind was a psychiatrist named Gottlieb Burckhardt. He was a superintendent, at a small Swiss mental hospital. In 1888, he was the first to experiment with removing or destroying parts of the brain to address perverted problems of the mind. He experimented on 6 people. His work was later criticized because he was unaware of brain functionality and, in fact, was not trained as a surgeon. One of the patients died 5 days later after the operation. One improved but later committed suicide. Another two showed no change, and the last two patients became quieter. It's a quote. About 50 years later, brain surgery for behavioral maladies got going again after a paper presented at a neurological conference in London renewed excitement for it. At that conference, John Fulton and his graduate student Carlisle Jacobson from Yale reported on an experiment they performed on two young chimpanzees, Lucy and Becky. And part of this interest of mine in lobotomies comes from some of the archival research that I've done on the early history of chimpanzees and a website that I've developed that's called The First 100 Chimps. And if you haven't taken a look, what I've done is identified, based on Robert Mearns-Yerke's lists that he kept in his papers, the first 100 chimps, and insofar as I can, if you click on each of them, you can find out a little bit about each of them. And in those papers, Robert Mearns-Yerke knew that he was a very important man. He kept every single piece of paper, so it's a vast archive. But in that archival material, I was able to uncover a great deal about this early experimental work at Yale and at Orange Park. What's missing from the accounts of the history of lobotomies is the full impact of Fulton's research on the chimpanzees. He and Jacobson at this conference only reported on the two young chimpanzees, Lucy and Becky, who survived the procedure. Ross, another young chimpanzee, died of dysentery while in the lab. An infant chimpanzee, Lou, died from meningitis following frontal lobe extirpation. She was involved with Lucy, Becky, and another chimpanzee named Jerry in Fulton's laboratory, where they were trying to, quote, create a group or colony of experimental defectives. Jerry died following an experimental operation. Lucy was killed and her brain prepared for study, and in an annual report from the lab in 1937, it states that Becky will be sacrificed within a few months. At that London conference, in their report to the attendees, Fulton and Jacobson described the behavioral changes that occurred after they ablated the frontal lobes of Lucy and Becky's brains. It's a small sample, just two chimpanzees, since the others didn't survive, and importantly, I think this is really important, the behaviors they reported were opposite one another. One became more agitated about things she didn't normally get agitated about after the procedure, and the other became less agitated by things that she used to be agitated by. So this really should not have led to the conclusion that the procedure be attempted on humans, and Fulton allegedly thought as much, although he did continue with his lobotomy work with chimpanzees. In addition, in the 1930s, very little was actually understood about chimpanzee behavior. The first infant that was bred and born in the laboratory, called Alpha, was in 1930, and in part, this was to try to understand chimpanzee development and behavior. Altering the developing brain of an infant and young chimpanzee, and you can see here, I don't know if that's Lucy or Becky. It might be Lucy. This image didn't have a caption, but she's a young chimpanzee. If you don't know chimpanzees, she's a young chimpanzee. And so altering the developing brain in infants or young chimpanzees without understanding their species' typical behaviors and their individual personalities could not lead to any kind of useful or respectable conclusion. But sadly, this sort of scientific rationality was a large part of the early biomedical research, and in the case of chimpanzees at least, this foolishness continued for another 50 years. At the conference, where Fulton was presenting, two important figures in the development of human lobotomies were in the audience, Igis Moniz, and a surgeon from Portugal, and Walter Freeman, who within months developed techniques to begin performing lobotomies on humans. The desire to destroy unwanted emotion actually overtook reasoned assessment, ironically in the name of scientific rationality. Lobotomy's reputation once ran so high that the Nobel Committee awarded the prize in medicine and physiology to Moniz in 1949. But within the next decade, lobotomy fell out of favor and its memory increasingly was vilified. The operation's descent into disgrace had many causes. For one thing, lobotomy never had a scientific basis, and animal work wasn't thought to be useful as a foundation for the procedure because researchers couldn't admit that animal models of mental illness existed. Sadly, that also led to a whole nother set of research. Many of you are familiar with the infamous Harry Harlow, but the work with chimpanzees was done before that to try to establish that you could have mental illness in animals. Experiments on sensory and maternal deprivation were being performed on chimpanzees to attempt to create animal models for despair, depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, addiction, and the like. Of course, the advent of psychopharmaceuticals also played a role in ending the lobotomy. In the history of medicine, the lobotomy is one of the rare examples in which those within the biomedical community themselves share their negative assessment. Dr. Newland, for example, began a 2005 discussion of the history of lobotomies, noting major steps in scientific progress are sometimes followed closely by outbursts of foolishness. New discoveries have a way of exciting the imagination of the well-meaning and misguided, who see theoretical potentialities in new knowledge that may prove impossible to attain. On occasion, the seemingly imminent is later shown to be far further off than originally thought, yet still possible to achieve. More frequently, the apparent prospect is revealed to be the result of unrealistic hypotheses based more on wishful thinking than on fact. In no branch of human thought have erroneous leaps of this kind been more prevalent than in the peculiar mix of science and art that goes by the name of medicine. Dr. Newland had a personal interest in the case of lobotomies. He suffered from depression early in his career and was hospitalized and almost had a lobotomy himself, but a young physician stepped in and recommended electric shock therapy instead. He ended up actually okay, had a long and notable career, and of this sorry chapter in medical history, he wrote, "Freeman's foolishness influenced an entire generation of psychiatrists, neurologists, and neurosurgeons and devastated the lives of tens of thousands of patients and their families. This tragic path can serve as a, quote, cautionary tale about those who come to believe that they are beyond the restraints of judicious professional behavior." Despite the demise of the surgical lobotomy and the scientific maladies that followed, there's more ideological sort of lobotomy, a cutting off of feeling or affect that has been much more successful, indeed entrenched, and it's to this sort of cognitive alienation that I now turn. So the second part of the paper is called Affect. In order to get to some of what I want to discuss about affect, I'm going to start with reflections on what happened this past week in the United States. And I want to look particularly at an op-ed written by a colleague. He wrote this on Friday, and it was in response to the tragic killing of two black men by cops, one in New Orleans and one in Minneapolis. And then, of course, this was followed by a killing of 5 police officers in Dallas. And I have to say, I'm really upset by this situation. So I couldn't come and talk to you about this form of craziness, and I use the term advisedly. I had to also talk about it. It turns out that this particular op-ed that a colleague wrote is apropos of the topic that I want to discuss. So this is a really, it's a time when it looks very much like, at least in America, people have gone mad. And interestingly, and I work in prison, I've been teaching in prison for about 7 years, most black men, the men I work with, refer to white people as crazy. It's you stay away from white people, they're crazy. And in this case, what we're seeing is this is not any different, this craziness is not any different. What's different is the social media exposure of this. And so what I want to talk about in particular, though, is the affect response to, this is Diamond Reynolds, who was in the car with her boyfriend, Philando Castile, who was assassinated by a police officer. Her 4-year-old was also in the car. And what she did was she recorded right after as her boyfriend was bleeding out in the car, she recorded what was happening. And so my colleague, Professor Rogers, in his editorial notes this. I've watched the video, I've listened to commentators reflect on Reynolds' composure. They often use her composure, her calm and collected demeanor, as an indication of her credibility. For both black and white commentators, her composure signals her trustworthiness as a witness. It's clear that Reynolds realized that being calm was necessary, both for the sake of trying to achieve justice for her boyfriend and to ensure that she and her daughter made it out alive. But we need to be very clear about what is going on here. He continues, "We would never expect others to display such composure in the face of such traumatic circumstances. We would not penalize their failure of self-control by tying it to untrustworthiness. In fact, we think, and rightly, that emotional eruptions at precisely this moment are appropriate. We think this, I suggest, because the gravity of the situation often elicits this from us. You have just lost a loved one under horrific circumstances and by one who is otherwise meant to protect and serve. It makes perfect sense to come undone in that moment, since the emotional eruption is often, at any rate, a judgment of value about the entire event." He goes on, "And yet we find ourselves holding Reynolds and other Black folks, often women, to a higher standard as a prerequisite to be considered trustworthy, capable of accurately recounting the injustice that has just been committed against them. In doing so, we commit another form of violence, the reverberations of which most assuredly affects the mental health of Black folks, reminding us yet again that what is expected of Black Americans is not expected of whites. It is demanded that we hold in and contain what should rightly be released, screams and tears, in short, pain." This is violence, I suggest, what Dinesh and others have called epistemic violence, and what Miranda Fricker analyzes as epistemic injustice. In particular, what Rogers is decrying is a type of testimonial injustice that denies an individual credibility in virtue of prejudice on the part of the hearer. Most women and people of color suffer from this form of injustice and thus experience all manner of credibility deficits, and when exposed to long-term epistemic injustice, many will alter their mindsets and behaviors in an attempt to conform to the epistemic norms, even though their or our attempts will seldom succeed. Most of us are familiar with the experience of having our perfectly reasonable claims dismissed because of who we are, perhaps in addition to the disagreement with what is said, as well as how it's said. There's a growing and important literature on the way these injustices further distort our relations with one another, and I think it's particularly important to be mindful of these credibility deficits in animal studies when we encounter scholars who express skepticism about what we might be claiming about what we know of other animals' experiences, for example. There's a cognitive alienation, a type of lobotomy at work here. So-called experts, I'm going to continue for a little bit on this case, so-called experts have been quick to diagnose Reynolds' calm response. Dr. Jim Hopper, a psychology instructor at Harvard, watched the footage and said her behavior was consistent with what he called a disassociative state. In the immediate aftermath of horrific violence, he said, victims don't always sob. People are literally not feeling in their bodies what's going on. The circuitry can basically shut down. This shutdown, I want to suggest, is emotional distancing, cutting off one's affect. It's to some extent a flight reflex in the face of extreme horror, sure, but I also think it's important to explore the social and political ramifications of the view that emotion must be cut off in an attempt to muster some credibility. In Reynolds' case, she at least had good reason to believe that her chance of surviving would be greater if she did not display emotion. But I see this as a type of coerced affect lobotomy, and it's much more widespread than the surgical lobotomies I just discussed. There's been a lot of interesting and conflicting work on affect theory over the last decade or so. Let me just go into this slightly. Some suggest that affect be understood as the automatic reflective phenomena that can be explained through some form of scientific reductionism, reinvented as embodiment. Still others see the affective turn as a measured response to the rejection of sentiment. As a philosopher, I wasn't actually aware of the way that sentimentalism in literature was deployed to alienate and subordinate, so this was really new to me. Colin Diane, in a review of Entangled Empathy in the Boston Review, really said this, I think, very clearly, and I just want to quote her a bit here. The language of sentiment animates subordination. A slave, a piece of property, a black cat. Once loved in the proper domestic setting, they arouse a surfeit of devotion, bonds of dependence that slavery apologists claim could never be felt by equals. Winthrop Jordan recognized this long ago in his brilliant analysis of abolition, White Over Black. Quote, a romantic sentimentalism was a symptom of, and perhaps a subtle yet readily intelligible social signal for, a retreat from rational engagement with the ethical problems posed by Negro slavery, end quote. Narratives of humane care are always conducted by the free in the name of the bound, their emotive impulse turning away from political action and towards the neoliberal performance of pathos. But against this take, thankfully, Colin Diane has now sort of seen that this needn't be the way to think only about sentiment. The effective turn is an intervention in political and literary invocations of domination. In philosophy, affect or sentiment has stood in opposition to reason in judgments of value, as well as in perceptions of good and bad and right or wrong. And this opposition between reason and emotion is at the heart of why the early animal ethicists like Bentham, followed by Peter Singer, make arguments based on our capacities to reason about similarities. It's in virtue of other animals being like us in morally relevant ways that we owe them consideration. And we come to this through reason, not sentiment. We certainly don't want to be thought of as old ladies in tennis shoes. And this isn't just a historical artifact. A few weeks back, J.M. Coetzee, in a lecture about animals, claimed, quote, this is what he said, "I am not an animal lover. Animals don't need my love. I don't care about love." I love that. I don't care about love. No care. I care about justice. I've been asking, why not both? Coetzee is admitting he cares. Why not about love? Why? The answer, of course, is political and gendered, and I think it's based on a misperception of the structure of our cognition. Singer, Coetzee, and so many others are in love with a liberal fiction that our relationships of care are private, beyond the scope of ethical reason. Of course, many don't want the state too intimately involved in their lives, although this is a complicated story that I don't have time for. But the idea really is that for most white men, their sense of themselves had been shaped as being thinkers and active actors, something they learn in relationship with others, but their ethical and political identity kicks in once they are beyond those relationships. We can call them post-relational. According to this post-relational fiction, I don't know if you guys have post-racial, but in the United States, to say that something is post-racial is to be engaged in a kind of fictional notion that somehow race and racism aren't a deep and abiding part of our day-to-day lives, which is kind of remarkable given the way that black bodies are assassinated at such a high rate in the United States at the moment, or at least we now know of it because of social media. Okay, so according to this post-relational fiction, care, love, and sentiment are private, feminine experiences. Justice, on the other hand, is seen as masculine and unsentimental. And of course, this binary thinking not only builds on stereotypical gender roles that preclude the idea that men are caring and obscures genderqueer expression, but it also ignores the particularity of caring relationships, which are informed by racial, economic, ethnic, cultural, and differently gendered experiences that are fundamentally about justice, or more precisely, injustice. Perhaps most importantly, those of us who are not under the illusion that one can ever be post-relational and who find that fiction undesirable to start with are further marginalized when we reveal that this view is untenable. We are denied credibility. We suffer from testimonial injustice. Justice and love aren't at odds because they can't be disentangled in any meaningful way. They're mutually informing. Any compelling moral or political theory has to attend to the interconnection between cognition, reason, and affect and emotion. Rather than generating distance between us and them, justice and love, in other words, to avoid this sort of lobotomy, we need courage, even while being marginalized, to bridge perceived gaps between emotion and reason, and to recognize the ways that each side informs the other without collapsing into it. As Bell Hooks so poignantly noted, the greatest movement for social justice the US has ever known is the civil rights movement, and it was totally rooted in a love ethic. Love is a combination of care, knowledge, respect, commitment, trust, and openness. Okay, let me turn now to part 3 on entangled empathy. So I've been thinking about building a bridge for many years and hope that entangled empathy may be strong enough to span these perceived gaps between reason and emotion. It's a view that involves developing and correcting one's perception to more accurately attend to others' well-being, to recognize and understand our relationships to others, and to see that our relationships entail responsibilities to ourselves and to other animals, and to do our best to promote well-being. Entangled empathy is a type of caring perception that I take to be a process that acknowledges the inevitable blend of emotion and cognition. Much of the development of entangled empathy, as I have been pursuing it, comes from my appreciation of the work of Iris Murdoch. Murdoch is critical of what I'm calling this post-relational moral agent, who is conceived as someone who already has a handle on any given situation, who knows what he's doing, whose thoughts and intentions are directed towards definite, overt issues, and whose responsibility is a function of impersonal knowledge. I love the irony in Murdoch's comparison of this sort of moral action with shopping, and I love the way in which being free, after her lobotomy, Patricia said she was freed now to be a shopper. Shopping, it's a great metaphor. The agent, this is according to Murdoch, the agent enters the shop in a condition of total responsible freedom and surveys the products and chooses to purchase one product over another. Shopping is public, and one understands the shopper through his choices and actions, much as the modern economist understands the preference satisfaction of economic man through his choices and actions. The inner life of the shopper, it's kind of funny to imagine, the inner life of the shopper, or of economic man, and of the moral agent understood through modern moral theory, is parasitic on his outward behaviors. But there's really only so much that one sees of that inner life through outer behavior. It's an anemic view of our inner lives, if it provides anything at all. Indeed, we perform behaviors that are meant to project meaning very different from what we internally experience. And that we do that is a good part of what therapy and other efforts at self-reflection start with. These outward behaviors become the focal point of ethical choice and action, and the inner life of the agent remains mysterious, or when accessible, thought to be beside the point. Entangled empathy is in part trying to solve that mystery and make the embedded and embodied process of moral perception more accessible. And it isn't just this first personal perspective, trying to become aware of that interiority, as it were, that entangled empathy is interested in improving. I see entangled empathy as requiring the movement from both the first personal to the third personal points of view, to meaningfully attend to the particularity of another being's interests, desires, vulnerabilities, what have you, as they occur in particular contexts, within social relations of all sorts, and to avoid projecting one's own state of mind on others. Entangled empathy isn't simply a form of ethical attention, it's a particular form of caring or loving attention that is directed toward another's flourishing. That might not seem so radical, but it is so radical for me as a philosopher to say that. To say this is caring, loving attention that we're paying attention to. And when I say it, I think, oh, this sounds really good, but I also am deeply aware of the sort of the resistance that philosophers have to this idea. Through entangled empathy, we see not only who we ought to attend to and what their situations evokes, but also whether and how we should respond in ways to help preserve and promote their well-being. And of course, we can go wrong. Often we err when we fail to grasp cultural understandings of the values and disvalues that are presupposed by these empathetic experiences. Evaluating these presuppositions is one of the tests of getting empathy right. So we have to do a lot of work and answer a lot of questions. It involves, for example, examining the conditions under which both the empathizer and the one with whom she's empathizing, how their choices are going to be formulated, to consider both the internal and external factors that help shape the deliberative capacities. Entangled empathizers have to be attuned to the distribution, both just and unjust, of various testimonial and hermeneutical resources that have an impact on how we make choices and how we act in light of those choices. An astute empathizer will also try to answer a whole bunch of other questions about themselves and their deliberative paths and the impact of various social and cultural institutional ideologies on those choices, how those ideologies shape the choices, how they prevent barriers or obstacles to those choices, and also to think about how successful one is when one's making these kind of empathetic judgments. Often what I was getting at earlier about this idea of trying the ways in which we can cut off certain parts of ourselves, that can really impact our ability both to empathize and to make sensitive choices towards others. We also want to develop a whole, maybe slightly different set of questions when we're in relationship with other animals, and when we're trying to empathize with them. For example, what were the early rearing conditions of these animals, and how did those early experiences shape their current experiences? I recently adopted a rescue dog, and I'm asking this question all the time about her early experiences, because she's quite interested in doing her own thing. What sort of species typical behaviors does a creature of this kind usually engage in, and does she have opportunities to engage in those behaviors? What sort of social relationships are important to her, whether they be with conspecifics or animals from other species, including humans? Is she able to be alone if she chooses? Is she able to make choices about who to spend time with? All of these sorts of questions, answers to these sorts of questions, will help us to develop better skills at perceiving and noticing the complexity of moral experience in the world and navigating the values round about us as richly and fully as we can. And it's a very different set of choices that we're considering than those enacted through typical shopping experiences in which mature actors are thought to be rational economic agents. These rational actors, those who are lobotomized, are not able to engage empathy, and that means that so many are not attending to the state of emergency that we live in. Of course, most of us are busy and absorbed in our own problems and projects and plans, and many of us don't have to think about the problems, for example, that Black Americans or most people around the world or the majority of other animals are confronted with in one form or another almost every day. The empathetic, caring, emotional side of our cognitive architecture has not, however, been surgically removed. And we can, I hope, attend even though it's difficult and painful. Some are suggesting, not surprisingly, that we ought to remain figuratively lobotomized and that empathy is a problem and we should not develop empathy. Paul Bloom is one of the most vocal critics against empathy, and I have a lot that I can say about these objections, and that I've been talking about entangled empathy around, and lots of people raise some of these questions, so I'm happy to discuss more of them in the Q&A. But I think that, but what these worries basically amount to is a fairly standard worry about emotion unhinging us and making us unable to work in the world. And that, I think, is part of what I'm trying to argue is a problem with this figurative lobotomy. There are very different ways of understanding what emotions are. And emotions, I think, are the kinds of things that not only are subject to our rational reflection, but I want to argue and do argue that our rational reflection is also impacted by these emotions. So it goes in both directions. So I want to end by saying a bit more about the entanglement part of entangled empathy. And I think, because I think it's important to identify the fullness of our cognitive architecture by recognizing what I mean by entanglement. I have a relational conception of the self, and I argue in the book that our agency is co-constituted by our social and material entanglements. Social entanglements often extend beyond the human and far beyond our geographical location. By material entanglements, I have in mind both the old sense of materialism, that is, our socioeconomic opportunities and limitations and our consumer choices, for example. I'm also thinking about the new sense of materialism, which would include our entanglement with the food we have access to, the safety of our physical environment. And these entanglements, I think, are quite complex and include our relationships to various others, the the child slaves who harvest cocoa for chocolate, the orangutans who are on the brink of extinction due to our consumption of palm oil, those working in sweatshops who provide cheap clothing, our greenhouse gas emitting choices for food that create climate refugees. All of these things, in part, constitute who we are and are part of our shopping experience. Our identities are not simply socially constructed. So when I'm talking about entanglement, I'm just not talking about social construction. Rather, we are who we are at any particular time as an expression of entanglements in multiple relations across space, species, and substance. And I'm here inspired by the notion of entanglement from feminist philosopher of physics, Karen Barad. Here's what Karen Barad, I hope you can see that, in part of what she said. Matters of fact, matters of concern, and matters of care are shot through with one another. All bodies, including but not limited to human bodies, come to matter through the world's iterative intra-activity. Differentiating is not about othering, separating, but on the contrary, about making connections and commitments. So the very nature of materiality itself is an entanglement. Ethics is therefore not about right responses to a radically exteriorized other, but about responsibility and accountability for the lively relationalities of becoming, of which we are a part. Ethics is about mattering, about taking account of the entangled materializations of which we are part, including new configurations, new subjectivities, new possibilities. Responsibility then is a matter of the ability to respond, listening for the response of the other and an obligation to be responsive to the other who is not entirely separate from what we call the self. We care about others, I suggest, because they are fundamentally part of our own agency. My failure to respond to others is not just a failure of my reasoning and my affect, but also an indictment of my very moral agency. Of course, it would be arrogant or naive to think that even though we co-constitute each other's agency, and that we can really, of course it would be arrogant and naive to think that even though we co-constitute each other's agency, that we can really ever know or truly understand another. And I agree that understanding another is probably close to impossible. But I worry that too often we take the possibility that we can't fully understand as an excuse to not even try to take the perspective of another. The clearest case of this lately is what white people in a culture of anti-black racism cannot understand, the full weight of years that burden those who experience racism, as well as the feeling of invisibility, rejection, extrajudicial violence, and disrespect that result from it. For some, this has meant that white people need to step away from the world. For others, it has meant that we need to work to develop and deepen our empathy. If we can't really understand the perspective of another human being, it may seem impossible to imagine understanding what a dairy cow or a lab rat or a captive chimpanzee might be thinking and feeling. But again, that it's difficult does not mean we're free not to try. Entangled empathetic moral attention involves working through complicated processes of understanding one another and other animals in situations of differential social, political, and species-based power. Usually what we get is just a glimpse. We never really know. But that we never really know cannot be an excuse to opt out of working at it. I take this to be a failure of both imagination and agency. To avoid this failure, we need to just say no to lobotomy and to develop our capacities of moral attention with a heavy dose of humility, hearty amount of care for each other, for other animals, as well as for ourselves. Thank you.